People often say that prostitution is the oldest job in the world. Torture and death must come in a close second, though. Archaeologists have found proof of executions among nomadic peoples in the Neolithic period, which was before society. It's not clear if these old bones tell the story of sacrifices to ancient gods or the willful killing of undesirables. But it is clear that killing people has been a part of the human mind since the beginning of modern human behavior. Putting people to death is still done in many countries and cultures today. Torture and other painful ways of killing people have also been around for a very long time. Getting violent with enemies is a normal instinct for all animals, and people are no different. As humans developed better tools, they also got smarter at finding new ways to hurt or kill other people. As we will see in this list, society has come up with some truly horrible ways to punish bad people. These practices are mostly now only found in stories and legends, but some are still done in some parts of the world in the 21st century. Are you sitting down well? Being sewn inside a dead horse is not only disgusting, but lethal. This was a straightforward but efficient method of putting individuals to death. The victim's limbs would first be shattered to prevent them from escaping, and then they would be squished and sewed into the stomach of a dead horse. The carcass would then be abandoned to the scavengers of the animal kingdom, which may include jackals, wild dogs, wolves, or vultures, depending on the region of the world in which the ritual was being carried out. It would be allowed to decompose outside of the city. Therefore, these beasts would consume the victim while they were still alive, provided that they were not already overcome by the putrid odors coming from the decaying equine carcass itself. Totally and completely revolting. The execution method was widespread throughout the early years of Christianity, and it is one of the acts of violence committed against Christian martyrs for which Nero is held accountable. In Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead, an ancient Greek version of the story that was perpetrated against Christians is described. An assembly deliberating about how to punish and execute a Christian woman with the utmost severity decided to stitch the woman's body into a dead ass, leaving only her head visible. This decision was documented in the Lucian records. They speculated that not only would she be roasted in its belly because of the intense heat of the Greek sun, but she would also be eaten alive by vultures, and more importantly, entirely unable to destroy herself. The brazen bull would cook people alive. Perillus of Athens came up with the concept of the brazen bull specifically for Phalaris, the dictator of Sicily. It would appear that Phalaris had become bored with the conventional methods of killing individuals and was looking for a way that was both crueler and more amusing. Perillus was able to provide him with this. The brazen bull was a sculpture of a bull made out of brass, as the name of the piece suggests. The artwork was designed to be hollow, and it featured a secret door at the back that allowed victims to be brought inside. A fire was started underneath the bull, and the resident who was unlucky enough to be there would be cooked to death. Because it heats up quite quickly, brass was selected as a potential material. One more facet of the brazen bull sheds light on an essential component of the practices of torture and execution. Because of this, Perillus equipped the bull with a network of pipes that led to its open nostrils. This allowed the bystanders to hear the victim's screams of anguish coming from within the bull's nasal cavity, much to their amusement. Perillus referred to the sound as the most melodious bellowing, as he was describing it. According to Lucian, even Phalaris was repulsed by the instrument, and as a result, he asked Perillus to give him a demonstration of how it sounded in order to better understand his feelings. After Perillus had climbed in, Phalaris had already closed the trapdoor and was now cooking him. Perillus was eliminated, but not before he was put to death in a more compassionate manner. Phalaris was not one to engage in hypocrisy. When Phalaris's people grew tired of the tyrant's cruelty, they ripped out the tyrant's tongue and fried him in the brazen bull, much to the satisfaction of Phalaris's former master, Perillus, who lived on after his death in the underworld. According to early church historians, the bull was also employed by Roman emperors to execute Christian victims. This information comes from the bull. Antipas, Pelagia the Virgin, Eustachius, as well as Eustachius's wife and children, were among the saints who were put to death in the bull. At the year 497 AD, a Roman usurper by the name of Berdunellus was likewise put to death at Toulouse by the ruthless Visigoth king Alaric II by being cooked in a variant of the brazen bull. Keel hauling would drown or maim victims. We now find ourselves in the golden age of piracy, during which an improvised nautical form of death was bringing joy to legions of hopeless felons who brandished parrots and eye patches. It is common knowledge that sailors are a hardy bunch. Therefore, in order to keep discipline on board ships that were out at sea for months at a time, the penalties meted out had to be particularly severe and serve as a lesson to the other crew members. The practice of keel hauling consisted of tying a criminal to a rope, which was then dragged under the ship, the keel, which either resulted in the victim drowning or, if the victim was unusually lucky, suffering terrible injuries from the barnacles under the ship, which would typically become fatally infected. Keel hauling was historically practiced by pirates. Despite their notoriety, pirates were not the only ones who engaged in the technique of keel hauling. The majority of navies in the 18th century resorted to the procedure, and in 1710, one English sailor's keel hauling for blasphemy, of all things, was recorded. Stripped of all his clothes except for a strip of cloth around his loins. To get him to his knees, a heavy weight made of lead or iron was attached on his legs, then let it crash down into the water unexpectedly, slid through the hull of the ship, and then, after a short period of time, was hoisted up on the opposite side of the vessel. This was stated multiple times, accompanied by the phrase, "after adequate periods of breathing." Few could last long sitting on the witch's billy goat. The witch's billy goat was a type of torture that had the ability to end a person's life. It got its name from the fact that it was used to coerce confessions out of those who were believed to ride goats instead of horses, which is why it was given that name. The apparatus was a large and roughly hewn pyramid made of wood that was mounted on a stake. Naked victims were lowered onto the contraption using ropes. The device was also known as the Judas cradle. The point of the pyramid would enter the victim's vagina, scrotum, or anus, and if the victim sat upon it for a sufficient amount of time, it would theoretically be able to cut them in half. The suffering that ensued almost certainly ensured a confession, regardless of whether or not it was true. The ropes and the width of the pyramid worked together to ensure that the cleaving process would take a significant amount of time, sometimes even several days. Because of the diameter of the pyramid, it was impossible to completely impale the victim. We will discuss this further in the following section. Instead, the primary goal was to gradually split the body in half. If the victim was too light to be affected by the billy goat, they were frequently subjected to having weights strapped to their feet. The Spanish Inquisition is given credit for inventing the witch's billy goat, which is a dubious accolade. But as news got out about how effective the contraption was, it quickly spread throughout Europe beginning in the 16th century and continuing onward. Being boiled alive was even more horrible than it sounds. This popular practice, which entailed placing prisoners in a cauldron of boiling water over a roaring fire and watching as they writhed in pain for hours, was yet another straightforward but efficient method of putting an end to people in the most torturous way possible before they were put to death. The victim's body would be cooked from the inside out if they were subjected to the experience of being boiled alive, and modern tales of persons falling into hot springs suggest that they would be conscious for the most of the ordeal. The smell of meat being cooked could provide malicious observers with an additional source of enjoyment. In addition, the skin would burn red and blister, and simply taking a breath in the stifling heat would be agonizing. At the very least, 3 individuals were put to death in this manner in England during the 16th century, all of whom were put to death for poisoning others. After Richard Rouse, the cook for the Bishop of Rochester, was found guilty of trying to poison his employer, Henry VIII pushed through an act of parliament that legalized the procedure. Richard Rouse was executed for his crime. Even the most boring legalese is unable to hide the gruesome nature of Henry's law. All and every person or persons which hereafter shall be indicted and condemned by order of the law of such treason, poisoning, shall be immediately after such attainder or condemnation committed to execution of death by boiling for the same. In other words, if someone is found guilty of poisoning, they will be put to death by boiling immediately after their conviction. The novelty of Rouse's public boiling at Smithfield attracted a record number of spectators, yet boiling alive was a significantly more prevalent practice on the continent. People who shaved off parts of coins and melted them into new cash were known as coiners. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, coiners were put to death by being boiled alive in France and Germany. In Asia, the Japanese robber Goemon Ishikawa was boiled to death, and in 1675, Bhai Dayala, a Sikh martyr, was also boiled to death in Delhi. Being flayed alive was once more than just a parental threat. The phrase, "I'll skin you alive," has a history that is both very scary and quite genuine. It was popular among previous generations as a way to reprimand youngsters who were being disobedient. People were put through this torturous way of execution by having their entire skin removed before they were put to death. Skinning a person while they are still alive can result in the victim's death from a number of different causes, including hypothermia, infection, loss of blood, and shock. In the carvings of Iron Age Mesopotamia, which date back to roughly 883 BC and earlier, depictions of opponents being slain can be seen. A particularly gruesome practice is described on the Rassam cylinder, which was carved around 636 BC and may now be found in the British Museum. According to the cylinder, they stripped off their skins and covered the city wall with them. However, the revolting practice did not end with the Mesopotamians and continued on into other civilizations. The practice of flaying alive has a long history of being associated with intolerance against religious beliefs, since it is recorded in the Torah that Rabbi Akiva was put to death by the Romans in this manner because of his preaching. One of the most well-known aspects of St. Bartholomew's martyrdom is the fact that he was stripped naked before to being crucified. In the year 415, a group of enraged Christian monks publicly executed the Neoplatonist philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria for heresy by publicly flaying her alive. Pierre Basile, who was responsible for shooting the arrow that killed King Richard I of England at the siege of Chalus in 1199, was skinned alive. This is an example of a more secular execution. Don't let Christian symbolism render you immune to the horror of crucifixion. The cross and crucifix are so common around the world that they take away from the truth of being crucified. Jesus was the most famous person to be put to death in this way, but many others also died the same way. After being flogged, the condemned would take the cross, or part of it, to the place where they would be put to death, just like in the New Testament story. Then, their hands would be tied or nailed to the crossbeam that was lying flat on the ground and was put up with ropes, so that the victim's weight wouldn't pull the wrists off the beam. A block of wood, supplidanum, would be put under the feet and tied or nailed in place. As in the New Testament, the condemned were hit from below, and honey was sometimes spread on their faces to draw bugs. The person who was being crucified would die of weariness, heart failure, pulmonary embolism, or not being able to breathe after days of being there. From the time of the ancient Greeks onwards, the crucifixion was only used for the worst criminals. It was a handy, obvious way to stop people from breaking the law. In 345 AD, the Christian Emperor Constantine made crucifixion illegal in Rome. However, it went on for hundreds of years in other parts of the world. Even in Christian France, the last person to be put to death on a cross wasn't until 1127, when Bertholda was put to death for killing Emperor Charles the Righteous. Crucifixion is mostly linked to ancient Rome, and it was used in Japan and Burma in more recent centuries. In England, traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. In medieval England, the way someone was put to death depended on their social class. People who were aristocrats were killed for murder, while people who were commoners were hung. People who planned to overthrow the king or queen or the country as a whole, on the other hand, would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The last person to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was Robert Emmet in 1809. The execution has its roots in the Middle Ages, so the best example is the sentence given to Major General Thomas Harrison in 1660. Dragged over a hurdle to the place of execution, and then you will be hanged by the neck, and if you are still alive, will be cut down. Your private parts, genitalia, will be cut off, and your intestines will be taken out of your body and burned in front of your eyes. Your head will also be cut off, and your body will be cut into 4 quarters. The King's Majesty will decide what to do with the head and quarters. Treason was treated the same way for everyone, no matter what class they were in. The most well-known people who were killed in this way were William Wallace for his part in the Scottish Wars of Independence, Hugh le Despencer for his alleged affair with Edward II, John Ball for his role in the Peasants' Revolt, Edmund Campion, the Catholic martyr, and Guy Fawkes for the gunpowder plot. A lot of people watched these killings because the traitors were famous and the punishments were horrifying to watch. As a warning, their heads were often put along London Bridge. The strappado could dislocate shoulders, causing likely death. There are 3 types of strappado torture, and all of them are unbelievably horrible. The person in the first picture had their arms tied behind their backs and a thick rope around their wrists that was connected to a ceiling beam or hook. The executioner would then just pull on the rope, lifting the condemned person up by their hands. This would cause unbearable pain and generally cause the arms and shoulders to dislocate because the shoulder sockets were supporting the whole body's weight. It is possible to add weights to the body to make the pain even worse. Those who lived were often disabled or had ligament damage that could not be fixed. There were a few sudden drops from a very high place added to the second version, which was otherwise the same. When the victim's fall was stopped, they felt painful jerks that would normally break their shoulders. The third version tied the hands to the front and put a heavy object on the bound feet, which also caused the legs to become dislocated. It was invented in Italy, as the name suggests, and Niccolò Machiavelli and Galileo Savonarola are thought to have been tortured with it. It was also used by the Nazis in prison camps during the Second World War to punish people who didn't follow orders. Impalement, ancient Mesopotamian slow death method. It has been used since at least the Code of Hammurabi, which is a Mesopotamian set of laws from around 1772 BC. There are two main types of impalement, which is when someone is killed by putting a sharp object into their body. Longitudinal impalement. A pointed stake was put into the victim's anus so that it went up and down the body, ideally so that the tip of the stake came out of the mouth or chest cavity, as shown above. For transversal impalement, the stake was pushed through any part of the body to the other side, like the gut or heart. Impalement patients could live for a few seconds or several days, depending on the type of impalement and the organs that were damaged. In history, there are many cases of leaders who were known for putting enemies on spikes. Before he put people to death, Emperor Nero would make them dig their own graves and put a stake in the ground. But Vlad Cepes, also known as the Impaler, was the most famous impaler in history. To scare off his enemies, he built a forest of 20,000 skewered Turks. And one time he ate dinner while dozens of Transylvanian Saxons were being impaled in front of him. The scavenger's daughter would squeeze blood from your anus, ears, and nostrils. During Henry VIII's rule, the scavenger's daughter was created, and people were also punished by being boiled alive. The scavenger's daughter, a demonic squashing device, was meant to get statements. It worked best when used in combination with the torture rack, which physically tortured people by stretching them horribly. The mean person who made it, Sir Leonard Skevington, the lieutenant of the Tower of London, gave it a name that isn't quite what it sounds like. The original name was Skevington's Daughter. Even though it wasn't used very often, the gadget was really scary. For the most part, the scavenger's daughter was made up of iron rings that were linked together in two places. The suspect was first made to kneel down as if they were praying, and then they were told to squeeze themselves as tightly as they could. The torturer would kneel on the victim's back and wrap one of the rings around their feet. Then the other ring would be wrapped around the small of their back and finally around their neck. If they were stuck in this position for up to 90 minutes, blood would fill their chests and then shoot out of their ears, nose, and anus. Not many people could wait that long before admitting something. Wheel torture broke bones, ruptured organs. One of the most important inventions in human history was the wheel, but it was also very good at hurting people. Commodus, the Roman emperor, is said to have used it as a form of torture. He would tie a wheel, either horizontally or vertically, to the body of a victim, and then have someone hit it with a large mallet, breaking their bones. Tying someone to the edge of a heavy wheel and rolling it over them to break bones and rip open organs was another common way to torture people. Saint Catherine was the most famous person to be tortured in this way, and the spinning firework is named after her. Europeans stopped killing Christians in the end, but they couldn't give up such a fun activity, so they started putting other people to death or torturing them on the wheel. In the Middle Ages, the main change made to torture was to make it more interesting for the public to watch. The offenders were then tied to the spokes of a wheel that was raised on a scaffold so that onlookers could get the best view possible as an executioner carefully broke each limb with an iron bar. The coup de grace was a blow to the head or heart which left a disgusting, pulpy mess. Scaphism, drowning in dung, eaten alive by vermin. Scaphismus, which was also called the boats, was an old Persian way of killing someone that was slow, painful, and embarrassing. Joannes Zonaras, a Byzantine historian who lived in the 1200s, wrote about how the soldier Mithridates was put to death for killing King Cyrus's mother in 401 BC. Two boats are joined together and stacked on top of each other. Holes are cut in the boats so that only the victim's head, hands, and feet are visible. They put the man who is going to be punished on his back inside one of these boats and then use bolts to connect the boats together. Next, they put a strong mixture of milk and honey in the poor man's mouth until he is sick. Then they put the same mixture on his face, feet, and arms and leave him out in the sun. Flies, wasps, and bees, drawn by the sweetness, sting and torture the poor man horribly. Also, his belly, which is swollen from milk and honey, throws up liquid waste that worms use to reproduce. So the person who is lying in the boats dies a slow and horrible death, his body breaking down in his own filth and being eaten by worms. The heretic's fork ensured an ironically devotional pose. Let's not forget about the Spanish Inquisition. They were good guys. In the end, all they were doing was getting rid of bad people for the good of both the bad people and everyone else. People were only put to death so that they could do punishment for a while in the hopes that things would get better for them in the next life. The people who were hurt must have been very thankful. Anyway, the Inquisition used some very cruel and sneaky ways to torture people to make sure that the punishment was enough to please God and that they would tell the truth. This is what the heretic's fork was like. There were 2 points on each end of the heretic's fork, which was made of iron. It was around the victim's neck while they were on their knees, with one end pressed into their chest and the other into the skin around their chin. Because the ends were sharp, they pushed the head up, which made it impossible to talk. If someone fell asleep, the fork would go through their head and chest, killing them. But this was all very nice, because this was a prayer pose that let the captives pray to God without being heard. Thank you, Inquisition. Scold's bridle silenced women, cutting tongues at times. Although it may not have been the most painful thing on this list, the scold's bridle, also known as a branx, was a potent mix of sexism, physical pain, and public shame. The scold's bridle was an iron frame that was put over the head of a female victim. A piece of iron was forced into the mouth to stop the tongue from moving, which stopped the spread of gossip, husbands from being nagged, or magic from being cast. The subject had to wear the bridle in public for it to be effective, and some of them were very fancy and had silly ears and other parts to make the effect stronger. Since it was made of iron, the scold's bridle was very heavy and meant to be very uncomfortable to wear. Some examples that are still around were even crueler than the ones listed above. By adding nails or just roughening up the iron object that was shoved under the tongue, it could be changed to cause terrible injuries. In these cases, the woman who was punished could not get away from having her tongue cut off or her mouth cut open, which could have caused a fatal illness or made it impossible for her to speak again. Even if they weren't hurt, people in the small, close-knit communities of the past would always feel bad about being punished in this way. Torture rack tore limbs, ruptured organs. The torture rack is mostly used to get information out of people, but it could also be used to kill someone, either on purpose or by accident. The torture rack was just a simple wooden frame with a bunch of rollers that were connected with ropes. The person was put on the rack with their legs spread out and tied with ropes that could be strengthened with a lever. The result was to stretch the body beyond what it could normally do, which caused the limbs to move out of place or even cut off. People died from either not getting enough blood or having their organs overstretched and breaking. The Romans came up with the idea for the torture rack, which was used all over Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern periods whenever there was a plot or rebellion. For hundreds of years, the rack was both well-known and feared as an instrument. In the 1600s, Baron Skanau of Bohemia was accused of heresy and given the harsh punishment of being beaten on the rack to get him to confess and give the names of his criminal partners. He was so scared that he cut off his own tongue to stay away from it. In a cruel move, the court changed his sentence to being put to death on the torture rack. Baron, good try. Flesh torn with red-hot pincers as torture. The creation of pincers was another important technological step forward for humans, just like the wheel. They made sure that people could handle red-hot metals, which meant that iron could be worked to make things like swords, buckles, and finally cannons. Because they could stand up to high heat, however, they were a cruel and very painful way to torture people. To make things even worse, torturers could heat the pincers very high until they lit up red, then pinch off pieces of skin from a victim and tear them off. For this job, regular blacksmith's pincers were changed by being spiked or pointed. Red-hot pincers were also the most painful way to cut off a criminal's sperm. Even though it's most often used to get statements or information out of people, tearing flesh could cause fatal infections or cut off arteries. Sometimes boiling liquids would be put into the cuts to make them hurt even more. Pincer torture was often part of a more complex murder. In an unforgettable essay, Michel Foucault talks about how Robert-François Damien was put to death after his failed attempt to kill Louis XVI. His skin was torn off in some places with red-hot pincers, his wounds were filled with molten lead and sulfur, and his body was finally torn apart by horses. Some people were eaten alive by rats. Rats will eat almost anything, alive or dead. There are many stories about people who were partly eaten by rats after a fall or heart attack that didn't kill them. This used to be seen as helpful to the government in many countries, not annoying. In the Elizabethan era, there was a cell at the Tower of London that was called the Dungeon of Rats. It was below the level of the River Thames. When the tide came in, rats in the area would sneak into the cell to get out of the rising water and eat the hurt, chained prisoner for free. English people were happy to ignore rats and let them do their bad things. But during the Dutch revolt against Spain in the 1600s, Diederik Sonoy, the leader of the rebellious Dutch people, did not want to take any chances. They were chained to a table, and he would put a caged rat on top of them and heat it up. The rat would furiously try to get away from the unbearable heat by digging down through the person's chest. Sonoy got important information about the Spanish moves this way, and he probably also learned a lot about how rodents live. Death by 1,000 cuts. Skilled, agonizing death. In China, death by 1,000 cuts was known as Ling Qi and was done there well into the 20th century. In this way of killing someone, they were tied to a cross and put on a table with a box of very sharp knives, each with a different part of the body written on it. The knives were covered with a cloth. As if it were a cruel lottery, the executioner would put his hand in the basket and pick a knife at random. He would read the writing on the knife, then cut the body part that was written on it. He would then pick up a different blade at random. Technically, the person could have died right away, because among the knives, 1,000 is obviously too many, there was one that told the executioner to stab the target in the heart to death. The person carrying out the execution would have to keep the victim living for as long as possible, which would require them to know a lot about medicine and how the body works. This also made it possible for friends and family to offer gifts to get to the heart of the matter. One change to the execution was that amputations were done instead of simple cuts, but they had to be done in a certain order with only one knife. Waterboarding challenges our claim to civilization. It looked like you were about to rest on your laurels. It's a shame that torture still happens in places that aren't ruled by dictators. Waterboarding is by far the most well-known example of this. Water torture is an old method of getting someone to tell you something by making them afraid they will drown. The only difference between this method and waterboarding is that waterboarding is meant to mimic the terrifying feeling of drowning instead of actually drowning the victim. A strip of cloth, a bucket of water, and a person are all you need for waterboarding. Plus, a mark of honor. Someone is lying on their back with the cloth over their face, which is tilted 10 to 20 degrees. Then water is poured over their face, filling their mouth and nose with water. This is so upsetting that they generally give up information. In some cases, the victim dies, but they can also get brain damage from not getting enough air, lung damage, or broken limbs from fighting against being restrained. The long-term effects on mental health are also horrifying. Still, the U.S. government said over and over again during the War on Terror that it did not consider waterboarding to be a form of torture. The military trains people to do waterboarding, and some people have written about their experiences. Chris Jocko, who used to be a military pilot, was waterboarded as part of his training when he was only 19 years old. For him, it felt like you were choking to death on water and couldn't stop being that way. I was pushing people away because it was too much for me. Like, I can't breathe. Water is going up my nose, and my throat is pretty much full of water. Even though Jocko knew that his teachers wouldn't really drown him, he still did it. Haven't we made progress as a species? We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.